Hey everybody, this is the final lecture for week 2 of the course, The Role of Public Opinion in a Democratic Society. And this is actually kind of a transitional lecture, and so I'm going to just already point out here at the beginning that this is going to gesture to other questions that are related to this that we're going to deal with in weeks 3 and 4, particularly about voting and citizen engagement and how should our electoral system reflect and actually respect the state of public opinion. For this particular lecture, I'm just going to bring up some of the questions and talk about kind of the difficulties that are associated with those questions without necessarily providing any answers. And as we move into week 3, which is all about our voting system, which is how citizen preferences, the public's preferences are translated into victory, and how that functions and what's going on in the very competitive environment of elections in America. The question of what role should public opinion play, it will come up again. So I just want to start that consideration with this lecture and try to keep it sort of tight to the questions, and just so you know that whatever dissatisfactions you have at the end of this lecture, like, well, wait, I didn't get that. Like, what role should public opinion play in a democratic society? Just know that this is intentional to open up that question for your in your minds rather than to answer that question in your minds. So to put this more specifically, how should public opinion be translated into political action? A democratic society is a society in which the people rule themselves. That's what democracy is. Democracy is often defined as majority rules, or it's defined as a system of checks and balances, or it's defined as voting where representatives get to decide the rules. These are all particular facets of what a democratic society is, but in its broadest sense, a democratic society is a society in which the people rule themselves. And when you're talking about public opinion in a democratic society, it seems like people's opinions ought to be turned into political action. They ought to become the rules and policies that govern us if we truly live in a democracy. And abstractly, yes, of course, we don't really have a democratic system unless we end up with outcomes that represent the will of the people. Now, I use that term will of the people specifically instead of public opinion because one of the big questions that comes up when thinking about the role of public opinion in a democratic society is how much is public opinion equivalent to the will of the people and how much is it not? It seems like it would be an easy synonym to make. What people believe in a nation or a state or a city is what is the will of those people. But that's not always the case. And there are big questions as to whether, the will of the people could be what's good for the people, not what the people think is good for them. And since we know already that public opinion is manipulable, even in a highly competitive environment, it's shapeable. Is public opinion really an expression of what the people are willing, or is it a representation of what effective manipulators are willing? So already there's a problematic question. Now, if we're really going to have democracy that's not just a total farce, there has to be some way of figuring out what the will of the people is and turning that into political action. If that's impossible, then democracy itself is impossible. And I'm not going to be that cynical, and I think it's not useful to be that cynical, at least to start off our analysis of how our political system functions. Clearly, one of the ways in which the will of the people is supposed to turn into political action is through our voting system. And that's what we're going to look at next week, and then we're going to look at reforms to the voting system in week 4. So this issue will come up again. Today I just want to talk in its sort of most abstract way, but I want to focus it on a specific issue or a specific scenario to take this from being purely abstract and at least make it concrete in a certain way. And you can read along with me here on the notes, and I'm going to just read the notes. Assume that a highly reliable set of polls, in other words, one that is most likely to really represent what people out there do believe, show that there's a decently strong majority of Americans, or even Oregonians, or we could say Portlanders, or people who live in the Northwest, or whatever it is, whatever our target population is. But let's say a decently strong majority, 55%, and that's actually in a democratic society, 55% is very strong, who favor a particular policy option, say single-payer universal health care or free public four-year college or universal background checks for gun purchases. Now, these are all liberal policies, these examples are familiar to people who are taking a course at Portland State University. But if you are against all of these, and you say, well, that's imagine that it's a 55% supporting some policy that you support. It could be anything. These are just three examples just to make it sort of concrete. But so we have a decently strong majority who support a policy option. And then the questions are these. How should and could those preferences be translated into political action in a democratic way? In other words, if the majority of people in a population want a particular thing, how do we translate that into political action? One obvious answer is just make it happen. Have it happen. That's what the people want because this is their expression of their opinion, and make it happen. Now, ballot measures are one answer to how could those preferences be translated into political action in a democratic way. When you get to vote on a policy by voting yes or no on a particular thing, then public opinion is being translated through the electoral system. Now, and again, you then have to take your opinion and turn it into an action, which are different. When you hold a view, you might not act on that view in exactly the same way that you hold that view. And that is very common. It doesn't make you a hypocrite to believe in one thing and to do another, right? You could say, believe in single-payer universal health care, and then when it comes to voting on a ballot measure that creates a single-payer system, say in Oregon, you might vote no because you don't think that particular version of it actually is the right version, that you have certain problems with that exact manifestation of the policy. You're yes generally, but you're no on this particular plan. Or you could go from yes when asked what you think to no when you're actually asked for a call to action. Be like, oh, wait a minute. Single-payer healthcare, now that it's on the ballot, the opponents of it are pointing out to me what all the consequences of this are. I lose my employer-covered insurance. Here's all the things it means. It's going to cost this. It's going to do this to the economy. I believe these claims. I'm going to vote no. I believed yes until that yes was put into a specific form that could be evaluated rationally with the available information. And now the call to action saying, turn your opinion into a vote is a no. This is one of the things that does happen and can happen. And this is why elections are great, is because they take us, it's easy to have an opinion. It's just like, advice is free. It's easy to give advice. Following advice or changing your behavior is not free. It's easy to have an opinion. So the public opinions on particular issues are essentially cheap. It only costs to pay the pollsters to find out what the public's opinion is. The call to action, the asking you to act on it, to vote for either people representatives who are going to push for this policy or for ballot measures that are going to directly create this policy, that's a different thing. So one way is that we could translate those preferences is to put them to the test with ballot measures. Now, what problems are associated with doing this translation? One of the problems is that even when you do like something, when it's put into a concrete form, it is now subject to very direct counter-arguments, and this is where our fear side and the negative emotions can be brought to play. To get somebody to vote no on an issue or a policy, you just have to show them one powerful problem. To get somebody to vote yes, you have to get them to rally behind everything that's in it, and maybe just say, okay, that's a problem, but it's a minor problem. It's a way easier thing to defeat an idea than it is to advance an idea. So that's one of the problems associated with doing this translation. Another problem associated with it in terms of ballot measures is what if the people don't really know what they're talking about? What if the issue is very complex and it's put into a simple form? And it's not that people are stupid. It's just that, healthcare is a complex issue, and the healthcare industry is complexly interrelated with the rest of the economy. Our health and well-being are important to us emotionally and psychologically. It's important for productivity in the workforce. Healthcare is a very complex issue. And putting some specific thing on the ballot measure is asking people who themselves aren't likely to think in complex terms, but even more importantly, aren't experts and don't have the time to become experts, to ask them to decide in a simplistic yes or no way about a complex issue. So that's actually one problem. You could just distrust people's ability to make the right choice on a complex issue. The second thing is you could just say a complex issue shouldn't be decided by a yes or no choice. So that's actually one of the problems. Another problem is what issues are right for direct choice and what issues are not right for direct choice. When should the people get to decide directly with their vote how to translate public opinion into political action, and when is that inappropriate? And that is a hard question to answer. And of course, different people will have different views, right? Some people might say every issue could be and should be put before the people because even if they don't have the requisite expertise or time to learn the complex issue, and even if it simplifies a complex question, we in a democratic society should get to live out the consequences of our specific choices. That's what we do as individuals. We make certain choices. We often make simple choices about complex things. Part of living in a free society is living out the consequences of your free choices. That's one opinion. Another group of people would say, the people should never be asked directly to decide on policy because yes or no policy questions are fundamentally misguided and misrepresentative of the complexity of the policy issue. Plus, any good policy is going to have way more than one question associated with it. So boiling something down into one question is actually distorting how the effective policymaking process should work. Now, those are the two poles of arguments on either side about using ballot measures. Now, if we don't use ballot measures, the other option is letting elected representatives choose. And then the third option is letting appointed experts choose. So there are definitely problems associated with doing both of those translations, right? How could those preferences be translated? Okay, we let people vote for people who will decide the policies. That's a very familiar thing. That's the original kind of democracy that we've had, representative democracy. It wasn't until just over 100 years ago, and it originated here in Oregon, that the idea of the ballot measure, directly letting the people decide policy questions, was invented. How can those preferences be translated? Well, let people run for office. Let people choose the people that they want to choose the policies, and then those people look at public opinion, compare it to the policy question, figure out what it is that the people want done, and then enact it. Now, one of the problems associated with doing this translation is that how do we know that the elected officials, one, are correctly reading public opinion? Two, how do we know that they're actually paying attention to public opinion and not just paying attention to their own private inclinations or their own supporters' ideas? And three, how do we know that the people who win elections are actually themselves suited to answering these complex policy questions? You're being interviewed for a job, and the interview process is to get people to vote for you, and then the job itself is to figure out the best policy solutions to the problems that face the people, and to do so in a way that the people would support. That job is very different than getting people to heed a singular call to action, vote for me. So that's one of the problems. And then, of course, the third option, letting experts decide, well, is that democratic? Is it democratic to let the experts say, well, we'll take into account effectiveness, we'll take into account what people think and want, public opinion, we'll take into account what's realistic and cost effective, and then we will enact the policies that solve the problems in the most effective way. We are experts, we've been trained, we definitely understand the complexity, we have all the relevant information, we have all the intellectual and professional skills necessary to make good policy choices. One problem associated with that translation is that sufficiently democratic? Does that really represent the will of the people, or does that represent the experts' limited view on what the people should want, not necessarily what the people do want? So all of those ways of translating public opinion into political action are potentially problematic. And we actually, I will say, and you probably realize this already, we have all three of those in our society. We have a mixed system where we sometimes let the people directly decide through ballot measures. We sometimes let people decide through their representatives who themselves decide on laws and policies. And then we sometimes have experts making those decisions. And then there's a complex interaction, particularly between experts and elected officials. And we're seeing that very much right now in the coronavirus pandemic, that we have a bunch of experts who know how to track infections and what the causes of particular kinds of increases and decreases in infection rates are, and they're advising elected officials who themselves are making the policies. So we see right now, we have a very clear example of two of these translation modes essentially running into each other in real time. But these are the three ways. Which of them is most democratic? And again, I'm not going to answer that question today. I'm just raising that question. Now, the final question is, it's actually two questions, but it gets us kind of a signal as to how we can begin also evaluating these other two questions. What role should the public opinion industry play in this situation, and what role might it play that it shouldn't? Here's just one example of a role it might play that a lot of people think it shouldn't, but it often does, is that experts decide that a particular policy or behavior is a good one, and then those experts make use of the public opinion industry to shape public opinion in the direction of engaging in that behavior. I talked about this in the last lecture, shaping public opinion in these public service campaigns, right? Somebody decided that drinking and driving is bad, not just somebody, but a lot of people, in a way, the public opinion industry is used to shape people's behavior to minimize this behavior that is seen as being destructive, right? Now, why should you not drink and drive? Well, because it kills people and because it endangers other people. You could say, well, in a free society, just let people take the risks they want to take. And if you're worried about drunk drivers, don't go on the highway. And if you want to drink and drive, you're risking yourself and other people's lives. And if you kill somebody, you go to jail. Just let people do it. Who decided that the will of the people was don't drink and drive? But I think it's clear that in this particular example, it's probably a giant consensus of people think that drinking and driving is wrong. Even though we can, I'm sure, find people who have an opinion that just let people be free and will suffer the consequences. That's what a free society is. You live out the consequences of people's freedom. But should the public opinion industry be used to reinforce by essentially manipulating people into adopting this behavior through these powerful messages? Should it do that or shouldn't it? Even if we know that there's something we want to do, an outcome we want to have that is beneficial, do we need to then make use of the public opinion industry to create that outcome? Or should we allow that outcome to come on its own through people's own unshaped choices? And that would be the truly democratic thing, right? In a democratic society, people should freely come to the conclusions that are best for them. Now, again, this, I think, raises a lot of difficulties because there's no simple answer, right? The public opinion industry should play the role of making sure that people do the right thing, and it should never not play that role. And then other people could easily say on the other end of it, we should never be manipulated. People should always come to their own conclusions. And even public service announcements that demonize sexual predators and get parents to be aware of the dangers of your kid's cell phone and making them vulnerable to sexual predators, that's still manipulation, and manipulation is bad. So these questions, there's pragmatic questions, there's pro-cons to all of the different approaches, there's also moral questions here. Which values do we want? Do we want good outcomes, or do we want more freedom? These are the tricky questions that get raised by looking at this question. How should public opinion be translated into political action? But even more broadly, well, what role does public opinion play in a democratic society? Should it turn into outcomes? And then, of course, what role should the public opinion industry, particularly the public opinion shaping industry, play in a democratic society? Do we have less democracy the more manipulation we have through the public opinion industry? Or does the heavy level of manipulation that the public opinion industry subjects the public to not impugn democracy because we have manipulation in a highly competitive environment, and often we're being manipulated in a good direction, or at least sometimes we're being manipulated in a good direction, right? Don't beat people in your house, don't be an inattentive parent, don't drink and drive, don't let your kids have guns. So it is a very complex set of questions. So this is the last lecture in week 2, and so hopefully what you've gotten a sense of from this series of short lectures is how is public opinion measured? What are the reasons why we should trust and distrust various measurements? how are those different measurements used by the people who are seeking to shape our opinions? And then here, all of that, I hope you've learned some specific mechanisms, and now we raise the question, the open sort of moral and political question of what role should public opinion and the public opinion industry play in a democratic society. I can't and won't decide that for you, but I will decide to end the lecture.